Right. Well, the holidays are all about celebrations and gatherings, but they can also bring a sense of isolation and loneliness for those struggling with fertility. The Oversharing podcast new limited series Baby Steps is trying to help by exploring the various roads to parenthood. Co-host Jordana Abraham speaks with doctors and relationship experts about fertility challenges. In this preview, economist Emily Oster discusses the importance of being honest with yourself when struggling with fertility.
It's actually worthwhile having a conversation about how far down this road are we going to go and what are the other alternatives we would consider to grow our family. And for some people, there are a lot of things that would be on that table, and for some people, there are fewer. But it feels like a conversation that probably wants to happen earlier rather than later.
Right. And it can be so weird, I think, to like, or not, weird is probably not the right word, but it can feel, I think, kind of sad or depressing to even have that conversation, because it almost feels like by saying something is an option, then you are
saying that the other thing is not going to work.
Right.
Yeah. But that's not true. I mean, that's the way that works.
The data says that that's not true.
That's not true. Okay. That's not true. And I think, people's psychologies around this differ. But I think for a lot of people, actually, there is a fair amount of value in having thought about that in advance.
Jordana Abraham joins us only on CBS Mornings. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. This is so great to be here.
It's such an important conversation. And I think, we were just talking in the green room. I know so many women struggling with this topic. A lot of people feel scared to talk about it. You dive right in here. You actually said, I cannot be happy until I'm pregnant. Can you take us into your own fertility journey?
Yeah, that was definitely a thought that I had in the beginning of struggling with all of this. And it can feel like a really isolating journey because people don't really talk about it. It doesn't feel like it's okay to talk about it. So it can feel really isolating on top of feeling, like you failed or like there's a lot of unknown when it comes to fertility journeys.
Well, when people do talk about it, it's often, why aren't you having a baby? The topic of conversation isn't really around the struggle. It's, why hasn't this happened for you yet? Which makes you feel even worse.
Exactly, because really all you see, especially on social media, are people's birth announcements or, the success at the end of it. And that's, what you see with most things on social media, but you don't really get the struggle. And a lot of people who are showing you, their successes, they had a lot of trouble getting there too, but it's just not really talked about it. Once you have the baby, you don't really necessarily want to think about the struggles that took you to get there. So this podcast is really about taking those stories, especially from like some high-profile people who really show that it is normal to struggle with this. It's so common, but you really don't hear about it because people don't really want to talk about it a lot of the time.
And it's particularly tough to talk about it during the holidays.
Yes.
I mean, you spoke with a clinical psychologist. You went on the map to say why and how does this impact our mental health? Take us through where you go with people and what you advise them on how to deal with it at this time of year.
Sure. I think, everyone has their own I'm not going to say everyone should share their struggles because, everyone has their own journey, their own way of thinking about it, and not everyone feels comfortable. But people don't know that, so people ask you, and you're not really sure what to do. I would say that, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, no. I mean,
it's a tough thing to talk about.
It's the holidays.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are asking those questions, but from a clinical psychologist point of view, how would you explain to them this is tough on mental health?
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting. When I spoke to clinical psychologist Dr. Georgia Whitkin, she was saying that a lot of people, they think you don't speak about things like IVF because there's a stigma around it. But really, people don't talk about their journeys because they don't want to necessarily have to update everyone about how it's going all the time. You want to be able to talk about it on your own terms. So I think just being really honest and just saying that to anyone who's maybe asking a question that you feel like overstepping, you could say, like, I'm struggling with this. I'd rather not talk about it. And most people will back off. Or, sometimes people will share their own struggles with you. And that, we found, I spoke to Erin Andrews, and she was saying she works with a lot of NFL players, and she works with a lot of men. And by sharing, she really heard the men's side of it. And you really don't hear that almost anywhere. Like, even for women, they're not speaking about it, but especially men. So I thought that was a really interesting conversation as well.
I was going to say, I mean, it wasn't until we were blessed to become parents that all of a sudden I realized that I had friends and family members who were struggling with infertility and had never spoken about it to me. And if people aren't talking about it, I wonder what it's like even for... I was trying to ask Gayle about this. Why is it as men, we're not aware with the difficulties and the struggles that families have with infertility. What have you learned doing this podcast?
I think men, they're expected to struggle silently, or and it's tough because most of the time, not all of the time, obviously, but women are the ones who are going through it, their bodies. So they're not really sure what to do. They're not sure what to say. They want to be supportive, but there's not necessarily that many outlets for men. So that was also just like a really interesting conversation, opening up the conversation, not just for other women, but for men as well. We have people on the podcast. Brian Kelly is a single father who, went through surrogacy to have his own child. So there are men going through it too. And I think to just normalize that conversation really just helps anyone who's seeking parenthood in any way, shape, or form, because there are so many different roads to parenthood. And I think the more we talk about all of them and the more people who go through them tell their stories, the more it normalizes it and just helps people feel a lot less isolated in those struggles.
Well, thank you so much, Jordana Abraham, for being with us. It's very important. Oversharing is available on all podcast platforms.